What happened to Lutheran ethics? This is a post from my Substack. You can go to click the link below and subscribe to receive the post, or just check out the written article. Lutherans are strong on justification but weak on sanctification. This refrain has been repeated ad nauseum, even being taken by some Lutherans themselves as a badge of honor. There is this unfortunate perception of Lutheran thought which conceives of Luther's reforms as decidedly non-ethical, as if the ethical dimension of the Christian life was a hindrance to the simplicity or the centrality of the gospel, rather than an aid to the Christian in his or her navigation of the world. Even more unfortunate than this is that some who proudly bear that name Lutheran have embraced such a caricature as if it were an actual theology. Thankfully, this perception that Lutheran theology is as a whole unconcerned with ethics is rather easy to dismiss through a quick examination of the many books and sermons on the subject throughout the history of the Lutheran tradition. With that being said, there are certain strains of anti-ethical thinking in corners of the Lutheran world today. Theology or ethics? There is a broader phenomenon here than just the relationality between justification and sanctification as it arises within a Lutheran context. This is part of a more extensive divide between theory and practice, or theology and ethics as disciplines. Debates surrounding this relationship between theory and practice were certainly not new at the time of the Reformation. We have twin strains of medieval theology and piety, scholasticism on one hand and mysticism on the other, that often approach the faith in distinct ways. The scholastic method prized syllogistic reasoning and the usefulness of philosophy. The mystics emphasized the need for deep prayer and one's experience of God in search of union with Him. While the best of the scholastics also had a mystical piety, in some cases there was a polarization of these tendencies, as if one was obligated either to choose the intellect or the affections. Now, the Lutheran Reformation contained within itself both of these elements, which it inherited from the earlier medieval era. Martin Luther famously decried the use of Aristotle's philosophy in his 1517 disputations against scholastic theology, while Philip Melanchthon was far less dismissive of Aristotle's methods of reasoning. Throughout the 17th century, theologians began to engage more deeply in the scholastic method, while on a popular level, Johann Arndt's True Christianity was shaping Lutheran piety among the laity in a decidedly more mystical direction. In his book, The Doctrine of Divine Love, Ernst Sartorius argues that the separation between theology and ethics began to grow during this era to a significant degree simply due to the separation of the subject matter within the written treatments of each subject. For example, Johann Gerhard wrote both dogmatics works and devotional material, and he was quite the master at both of those, but he approached these two sets of texts quite differently. Even today, the reader of Gerhard's sacred meditations might have no interest at all in Gerhard's far more technical theological commonplaces. In the generation following Gerhard, theologians began to expand significantly on theological prolegomena, devoting far more attention to questions about the nature of theology, the role of reason, and natural revelation. In Sartorius' reading of history, the method of doing theology began to eclipse the content of that theology. It was this overemphasis on the particularities of method that began to abstract theology from life, making dogmatic claims more propositional than participatory realities. Sartorius further argues that this divorce between mind and heart within theological texts, even while the authors of the texts themselves did not actually intend such a divorce, led to the reactionary movement known as Pietism. Rather than a proper integration of theology and ethics, many of the Pietists contrasted practical Christian spirituality from a deeply studied theology, thus privileging the mystical approach over the scholastic. While the best of the Pietists did not do this so strongly, on a popular level, academic theology was not only unpracticed, but was sometimes viewed as an actual hindrance to Christian piety. Now, for Sartorius, this divide fed rationalism in Germany in the 18th century. This focus on method for method's sake laid the soil in which Kant's philosophy would grow, a philosophy concerned almost entirely with prolegomena. Kant's rationalism allowed him to engage with discourse about method without seriously engaging with any of the actual content of theology whatsoever. This is all quite relevant to Kant's own pietistic upbringing. Further, though Kant had a lot to say about ethics, his ethical writings are nearly entirely methodological. Ethical discourse is sucked dry of its heart and is nothing more than a rationally constructed set of duties to which all rational men and women must conform. So how exactly do we bridge this divide between theology and ethics? This divorce between theory and practice, or theology and ethics, that occurred during the Enlightenment is a phenomenon that's been noted by diverse thinkers from divergent Christian traditions. And in light of that fact, various solutions have been proposed as to how exactly to bridge this separation. The one which is perhaps most well known and most often criticized by Lutherans is that of Karl Barth. For Barth, Lutherans are, at least partially, at fault for the distinction between theology and ethics due to their strong divide between the law and the gospel. As Lutheran theology conceives of these as the two separate words of God that he speaks, it divides God's good news from his commands as two completely divergent ideas and thus separates them into bifurcated disciplines. The resolution for Barth is to instead conceive of the law as a form of the gospel. The law is the same word of God as the gospel, with the law being identified as the call of God to act ethically in the present moment. Though apparently that call of God didn't include refraining from decades-long adultery on Barth's part. In response to Barth's conflation of God's two words, some Lutheran theologians began to distinguish more strongly between these two ways that God speaks. Werner Ehlert, for example, speaks almost exclusively of the law and the gospel in terms of their effects of condemnation and justification, respectively. For Ehlert, the third use of the law, its positive function as a guide in the Christian life, was not present in Luther and was instead a Calvinistic innovation that was borrowed by Philip Melanchthon. Though Ehlert himself certainly did not ignore ethics, he wrote quite a bit on ethics, especially in his book, The Christian Ethos. This began a tendency away from ethics for many Lutherans, as the fear of a conflation between law and gospel became ever more present. This issue of the relationship between theology and ethics, or doctrine and practice, is one that I have thought about quite deeply. In many ways, it's really been the driving force in all of my work. I am convinced that there are beneficial aspects of both scholasticism and mysticism, which were absorbed by the Lutheran Reformation, though, of course, altered significantly from their medieval forms. And that a robust theology and a life of piety not only can coexist, but must coexist. And I don't just mean that they have to coexist because the Christian should try to perform good deeds. I mean that there is an inherent connection between the two, such that theology and piety are not two totally separable realities that somehow have to be squeezed together. A proper understanding of this interrelatedness is not to be gained by conflating the law and the gospel, but by recognizing how both the law and the gospel form theology and ethics. It is not simply that theology is the study of the gospel and ethics is the study of the law. The law and the gospel paradigm forms both Lutheran theology and Lutheran ethics. And so now we turn to Ernst Sartorius and his solution here. Ernst Sartorius provides quite a helpful resolution to this ever-present problem of theology's relationship to the ethical life. And his proposal is one that has not received the attention that it deserves, especially not in the 20th century. As I am unable to do justice to it here, I recommend reading the author himself. You can watch my series of videos, and I'll link those below on a playlist on Sartorius. And if you'll bear with some brief self-promotion here, I am currently in the midst of editing a new edition of his magnum opus, The Doctrine of Divine Love, which will be worth picking up if you're interested in this subject, which, along with new typesetting of the older translation, is also going to have translations of some of the extensive Latin text throughout the work. Sartorius contends that the core of all one can and must say about God, including his nature, his works, and his commands, is summarized in that very simple statement of St. John, that God is love, 1 John 4:7. Divine love is not only at the heart of these two disciplines, of both theology and ethics, but it's the heart of reality itself. The ontological foundation of all existence is an eternal triune communion of love. Creation is an external expression of this love, which is at its core self-giving. In contrast to the intertrinitarian bond of love which binds the three divine persons together who are mutually worthy and deserving of love, the love which brings forth material reality is a creative love. It does not seek out an object that is already worthy of love. Rather, in the act of loving itself, God creates the object that is to be loved. In other words, love itself is the very instrument of creation. As Martin Luther says in Thesis 28 in his Heidelberg Disputation, the love of God does not find, but creates that which is lovable. Divine love is a sharing love. Not accidentally, but by its very nature. The divine love is eternally given and received within God's ad intra acts of generation and spiration. God freely chose to share this love with others outside of himself. This sharing of love ad extra is accidental rather than necessary. There is no obligation in God for him to create. It is not, however, totally distinct from God's ad intra, internal love. In both creation and redemption, God invites others to participate in that very same love whereby the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit are eternally bound to one another. Divine love is participatory, both ad intra and ad extra, though in distinct ways. Sartorius argues that this is deeply embedded into the nature of humanity itself, as is testified by the Genesis account. In this rendering, the divine image consists in the capacity of men and women to uniquely reflect and exercise love to one another as personal subjects, and to serve as instruments of God's creative love in their care for the rest of creation. Genesis 1:26-28. This centralizing of love within the very nature of humanity is why all ethical demands can be summarized as acts of love. Romans 13:10. Humanity was created in, through, and for love. Redemption, similarly, is an act of divine love and divine condescension. Since love is a self-giving by its very nature, the redemption of a fallen creation is the ultimate reflection of love. On the cross, not only does the Son offer himself for created beings, but to those who are deserving the very opposite of love. Romans 5:8. Theology and ethics are united because both disciplines are rooted in the same reality, divine love. Or, as St. John summarizes, we love because he first loved us. 1 John 4:19. Theology is the study of God as love, and of how love redeems sinners. Ethics is the study of how that same love is shared by the Creator with his creation, and how we are called to exercise that love toward others. Both the law and the gospel are defined by this love, but manifest it in distinct ways. The law is the revelation of God's eternal character and will. It shows the way in which love is to be exercised by creatures, and when speaking to sinners, i.e., everyone save Jesus himself, it reveals the many ways we have not acted in accord with God's loving character. In opposition to our created purpose, our lives are not defined by self-giving, but by self-serving, which is love's opposite. The gospel displays God's love as given in his promise of mercy and grace for the sake of Christ. This centrality of love in Sartorius' theology is not in any way in opposition to the importance of faith as the sole instrument of justification. As he explains throughout this text, love does not justify sinners because love is giving by its very nature. And instead of the sinner giving something to God as an act of righteousness to achieve justification, the Christian is justified through receiving. And faith, unlike love, is an instrument of reception. And so faith is a recognition of one's own lack and a consequent trust in the promise of another to provide for it. Well, it is true that the sinner is justified by love in the sense that God's own self-giving and his own love constitutes the Christian's righteousness. The Christian is in no way justified by his or her own love. Faith and love are intimately connected because faith receives God's free, justifying love, which then works through the Christian who mirrors God's self-giving in service to the neighbor. So is this the right solution that Sartorius provides for us here? Now, because I've been editing this book of Sartorius's and recording a series of videos on Sartorius's writings, as well as engaging in a couple other projects related to this, I have been more deeply engaged in this particular text than I have with anything else I have read in quite some time. Now, while I've read much of this text in the past, though not in its entirety, it speaks to me now more strongly than when I had read it in the past. I don't know why that's the case exactly. Perhaps I hadn't spent enough time in other sources then to give it a proper evaluation in comparison, or maybe I'm just at a better point in my own life to receive Sartorius's words now than when I read it in the past. Whatever the reason might be, I've found engagement with this particular text to be a deeply edifying experience as I have done so. It's a rarity to both feel like your intellect and hearts have been deeply engaged through the same work, and Sartorius does this very well. Now, there are places I disagree with Sartorius, which is to be expected with anything. He has those tendencies found within many 19th century theologians of reading language of persona as conscious subject, which might be seen as moving toward a more social Trinitarian model. Though, to be clear, he relies almost entirely on Augustine, Gerhard, and Melanchthon in his exposition of Trinitarian theology. There are also some statements that sound a bit canonic at times. Nonetheless, these are really quite minor complaints, and they're really just an issue of maybe terminology used in a couple places. The bigger question really is whether Sartorius is correct in his critiques of the later Lutheran scholastics. Did they really focus so much on prolegomena that the content of theology itself was lost? Did they practice so much apophatic theology that any cataphatic or positive description of God as holy love was just relegated to a secondary position? Were they really indirectly responsible for the rise of German rationalism? I'm really not sure, honestly. Prolegomena issues are of significant interest to me, especially in our current era where we seem to have no conception of first principles at all, and we often waste time on secondary issues without discovering why exactly it is that we disagree with one another, because we never get to those primary source issues. To be clear, Sartorius doesn't reject prolegomena entirely here, but the unnecessary expansion of it. I'm yet to be convinced by this part of his argument, though I'm not ready to dismiss it either. Nonetheless, agreement on the genealogy of these issues is not a necessity in order to get a benefit from Sartorius's work here. Now, regarding the heart of Sartorius's argument, his most significant claims are simply explanations of what's already present in the writings of St. John in the New Testament. The apostle defines God as love, something which is not said of any other divine attribute. Further, he continually speaks of love for one another as an outgrowth of that same love by which God first loved us. And so Sartorius is really just writing a commentary on these very simple words of the apostle, and he's doing so with that same kind of passion for Christ that St. John himself expresses in his writings. There is a reason why Sartorius is often referred to as the St. John of Lutheranism. And when all Lutheran theologians sometimes seem like they all want to be St. Paul, maybe we just need some more St. Johns. Well, thanks so much for watching. Make sure you subscribe if you haven't yet for future videos. We'll see you in the next one. God bless.